To really talk about CinemaScope and its impact on cinema, we need to understand a little of what cinema was like pre-1950s. Since its early beginnings, the shape of the screen, its aspect ratio, was almost squared around 4:3, 4 units wide and 3 units high, and it stayed that way for more than 70 years. Although several early tests had been conducted on wider formats, the Big Trail released in 1930 was possibly the most notable. Shot in black and white on 65mm film, it was John Wayne's first lead role, but at the time there was no real impetus for wider formats, so the 4:3 box-shaped image remained. There was, however, something around the corner that would provide that impetus. In the late 40s and early 50s, television began to take hold, and studios and cinemas began to see their audience numbers decline. People got used to the idea of being entertained at home from this new box in the corner. Television was at first a novelty, but very quickly became a threat to the cinema. Interestingly, television ultimately copied the same 4:3 aspect ratio, a picture shape that people were accustomed to in cinemas. Television screens at the time were tiny, some less than 12 inches across and of course in the beginning black and white. But the small picture in a big box in the corner caused an unrelenting decline in cinema audiences. Studios looked to what they could offer that television couldn't. The answer was size, color and spectacle. So they went big. Very big. Fred Waller, Lowell Thomas, and Mike Todd along with Merian Cooper got together and used a system that Waller had created much earlier but never fully developed. They called it Cinerama. It used a system of 3 interlocked projectors beaming onto a wide, deeply curved screen. This produced an extremely wide 146-degree field of view, close to what we see with our eyes. Not only was it wide but taller too. Instead of the standard 4-perf pull-down, each camera frame was 6 perforations high. This meant an image of unparalleled definition because of the enormous combined frame size. The film was also shot and projected at 26 frames per second instead of the standard 24 and was accompanied by 7-track magnetic audio running on a separate 35mm film strip. It was the big gun that would drag people back to the cinema. Cinerama and the evolution of CinemaScope. Cinerama was first commercially demonstrated on Broadway on September 30, 1952. The film was called This Is Cinerama. It was created to demonstrate the potential of Cinerama and of course contained the now famous roller coaster ride that at the time felt so real it induced motion sickness in some people in the audience. There must be admiration for Waller, Mike Todd, and the developers of Cinerama to have had the vision and daring to move cinema technology forward so much in one giant leap. To jump from a flickering 4:3 mostly black and white picture to something so massively impressive is astonishing. But the system had flaws, and there were many. The triple cameras were heavy, bulky, and noisy. The 3 lenses produce odd optical effects when used in close-ups. Actors had to avoid the seam area where the images would join up. The problems were numerous, and even though they tried various tricks, it was impossible to hide those troublesome joins. To combat television, the studios needed a system that could produce an impressively wide picture but also allow directors to use standard 35mm film and equipment. A system that would not take away filmmakers' freedom to choose what shots or what lenses to use, and also one that would be relatively cheap for exhibitors to install. 20th Century Fox found the answer across the Atlantic in France. In 1890, Ernst Abbe and the Zeiss Company in Germany developed a lens with cylindrical elements that had the ability to squeeze images in one direction. This is probably the earliest mention of anamorphic lenses. Henri Chrétien, a French astronomer and inventor, equipped with a great mind and practical ability, made further developments in France to make the lens suitable for motion pictures. He named the lens Hypergona. The lens had the ability to capture a very wide field of view, something that at the time was not possible with spherical lenses. Fox's laboratory set about implementing a new widescreen system. By adding the lens to the front of a camera, an extra-wide view could be photographed. The horizontal axis was compressed roughly 2.5 times while the vertical aspect remained the same. The squeezed image could be placed on standard 35mm movie film. A similar lens had to be put in front of the projector to squeeze the image onto the screen, giving a wide view and an aspect ratio of about 2.55:1. Fox was very pleased with the results and set in production 2 pictures to be shot with the new lenses. But how could they market this new process? They needed a name, but what? Chrétien's name for the lens, hypergonar, didn't exactly roll off the tongue. They needed a name with more appeal. Television station KCOP Channel 13 in Los Angeles had registered a process for recording TV shows onto film. They called their process CinemaScope. Fox liked the name, so they paid the station $50,000 for the trademark, and 20th Century Fox CinemaScope was born. On the 16th of September 1953, the first CinemaScope picture was presented at the Roxy Theater in New York. The Robe with Richard Burton, Victor Mature, and Gene Simmons was a biblical epic with a cast of thousands. Presented on a screen that was not only 2.5 times wider but also taller than anything that had been seen before. The sound was from 4 magnetic tracks, one each side of the sprocket holes that fed speakers left, center, and right behind the screen, and also an ambient effects track around the auditorium. The film also carried a traditional optical track for theaters not equipped for magnetic sound. The overall effect was incredible, and it received an ecstatic reception from the star-studded audience. Fox quickly announced all future pictures would be now shot in CinemaScope. Very quickly other studios were trying to develop their own systems, but ultimately were able to license CinemaScope from Fox, at a substantial fee of course. Digital cameras today can shoot wide without using an anamorphic lens, but some filmmakers continue to put a scope lens on the front end to get the nostalgic CinemaScope look. If it's not wide and in scope, then it ain't a real movie. The effect of the CinemaScope widescreen format echoes to this day. Your brand new 100-inch 4K television owes its aspect ratio to a CinemaScope shape forged back in the 50s. And that, as they say, is history.
First the screen was silent.
Then it talked.
Then color.
Now the greatest advance of them all, the picture floats off the screen.
In 1952, it was a little film called Bwana Devil that ushered in the so-called golden age of 3D.
Never before has the color camera captured such savage jungle violence as killer lions terrorize a fierce warrior tribe, and a relentless white hunter challenges death itself for the love of his beautiful bride. It's the unforgettable African adventure story that made screen history.
Film attendance was on the decline, television on the rise, and the industry was latching on to every technological innovation they could come up with, no matter how obviously gimmicky it may have been, all in effort to pull paying customers back to the silver screen. Cinerama, Smell-O-Vision, Percepto, 3D. Bwana Devil, released in the Natural Vision 3D system developed by brothers Milton and Julian Gunsberg, was the spark that led to an all-out 3D craze. Monster movies, musicals, animation, westerns, Vincent Price B-movies, even Alfred Hitchcock did Dial M for Murder in 3D. The glasses soared throughout the early 50s. In 1953 alone, there were more than 40 individual 3D releases. But a happy marriage, it was definitely not. Since the beginning, 3D has attracted as much trouble as a Hitchcock blonde. Because they required 2 projectors to be shown, that often meant 2 projectionists, which translated to higher costs for the theater. And because both prints had to be projected at exactly the same time, if one print got out of sync by even just a few frames, the entire film would be rendered nearly unwatchable, leading to numerous reports of headaches, eye strain, and nausea. Despite its initial craze, 3D in the 50s was expensive, cumbersome, and prone to error. And by 1956, it had all but vanished from the marketplace, overtaken in popularity by its widescreen competitors.
Popcorn from the concessions, a speaker hung from the car, and plenty of privacy. American drive-in essentials. By the late 50s, more than 4,000 were scattered across the nation. There's something magical about watching cinema's biggest stars under the stars.
You'll be notified in plenty of time when the next show is about to begin.
The economic boom of the post-war period benefited the white teenagers of America as much as their parents. These children of the baby boom had expendable incomes from babysitting, mowing lawns, and allowances.
Parents gave their kids money, and kids had opportunities to make money. So they had money to buy records, they had money to buy clothes.
With the use of transistors in radios, music became completely portable. Kids could listen to their music without disturbing parents, and they could listen to it anywhere they wanted, in their bedrooms or on the street.
They had access to an automobile, which was unusual. There were radios in the cars, so all of a sudden this music became the soundtrack for a very large and affluent group of people.
The music on that soundtrack was the hot new sound of rock and roll. In post-war America, black recording artists, many of them blues performers, created a style of music they called rhythm and blues, a musical hybrid of blues, country boogie, gospel, and big band jazz. When rhythm and blues added electric guitars to the mix, a new sound was born.
The roots of rock and roll come from a lot of different areas. I think the biggest one is rhythm and blues, which was a very popular form of music with African Americans, hadn't quite crossed over to mainstream America, so that's one of the reasons why it sounded so new to most people.
Traditional jazz also contributed to the sound of rock and roll, with the saxophone and stand-up bass, especially in the early days of the new sound. Saxophone solos were often heard long before guitar solos became popular.
The other influence, too, is American folk music and bluegrass, traditional country and western. Hank Williams Sr., artists like that, Flatt and Scruggs, big influence on some of the rockabilly stuff.
In 1953, Cleveland disc jockey Alan Freed played this new kind of music, this so-called Negro music, for his white teenaged listeners. It instantly became wildly popular. Thinking the new sensation needed a name, Freed coined the term rock and roll, and it stuck. Soon, DJs in other cities around the nation jammed the AM radio waves with the new music. If one person could be given the credit for inventing rock and roll, Chuck Berry is probably the one. Berry mixed all the right ingredients, country western guitar licks and a rhythm and blues tune with lyrics about fast cars and good-looking women. While he had been performing rock and roll songs for a few years, Berry's first mainstream hit, Maybelline, only came in the summer of 1955, when he crossed the color line and became a huge success with white audiences. Richard Penniman, using the stage name Little Richard, crossed over to white audiences with songs like Tutti Frutti, Lucille, and Good Golly Miss Molly. Sporting makeup and an extreme pompadour, this gospel singer from Georgia electrified his audiences in outrageous live shows. As the popularity of the music grew, white musicians co-opted the style but toned down the sexuality for a mainstream audience. Music stores were flooded with dozens of new recordings. In 1954, Bill Haley and the Comets released Rock Around the Clock. An immediate hit, the song was adopted as an unofficial anthem of the very first rock and roll generation. Not everyone was captivated by the sound of rock and roll. Many adults, especially those with conservative religious backgrounds, protested the spread of this new music. They claimed it was ruining the youth of America by overexciting their libidos with its hard-driving rhythms, suggestive lyrics, and the wild dancing brought on by the music. The anti-rock and roll movement, however, was never strong enough to stop the swelling tide of the new sound. As quickly as its popularity grew, rock and roll just as rapidly became part of youth culture in the 50s and American culture in general, especially when a 19-year-old truck driver from Memphis started recording.
It was Sam Phillips at Sun Records who said, this is legendary, he said, if I could find a white man that sang like a black man, I'd make $1 million. And it wasn't a racist remark, it was just saying that if I could find somebody who'd sing with that energy, that amount of sexual tension, and that comedic sense too that was in rhythm and blues, he knew that he would have a winner.
Phillips found that winner. His name was Elvis Aaron Presley. Elvis Presley recorded his first song, That's All Right, in 1954. He combined a bluesy country boogie style with hard-driving rhythms and distinct vocals. Even though the record wasn't a huge success, his live performances with swinging hips and bedroom eyes won many fans. By 1956, Elvis had 3 hits on the record charts: Hound Dog, Don't Be Cruel, and Heartbreak Hotel. His slurring, sexy vocal style became his trademark and earned him the title King of Rock and Roll. But Presley had to temporarily give up his throne when, in 1958, Uncle Sam tapped him on the shoulder.
Pulling into Brooklyn was a very important person, none other than Elvis Presley. Private Presley, soldier nowadays in Uncle Sam's service. When he's demobbed, Elvis hopes to develop his talent as a movie actor. Meanwhile, it's the army for Elvis the Pelvis.
When the film industry realized that America's youth had time on their hands and money in their pockets, they produced movies marketed directly to teenagers.
Never before has man been transformed into such hideous proportions. Never have teenage girls been subjected to the terrifying ordeal in the fantastic room of torture.
We saw the rise of the youth movies, the biker movies, the beach movies that came out, rock and roll movies, and movies featuring big Hollywood talent like James Dean, Montgomery Clift, and Marlon Brando, people that youth culture were able to relate to and to kind of adopt as their icons and the people that express their values and their sense of society and culture.
Marlon Brando starred in a 1954 film, The Wild One, as the leader of a motorcycle gang. Brando brought a complexity and vulnerability to the character, an angry young man rebelling against social forces he couldn't fully comprehend. As an actor, Brando had already made his mark in the stage and film versions of A Streetcar Named Desire. Of all the actors who admired and emulated Brando, only one achieved icon status of his own, James Dean. His hypnotic, gritty performance of a troubled teenager in Rebel Without a Cause made him an instant star. Dean was the loner who could be tough but tender, an actor whose characters shunned society and cried out for understanding in the same smoldering look or briefly muttered line. His roles epitomized the moodiness, anger, and alienation of his generation, and the desire to break free from mundane existence. Dean made only 2 other films, East of Eden and Giant, before his life ended at the age of 24. On September 30th, 1955, Dean collided with another car when driving his beloved sports car, a Porsche Spyder, on a California road. In contrast to Brando and Dean stood the all-time blonde bombshell Marilyn Monroe. Her innocent, natural, and overt sexuality made her the indisputable sex goddess of the decade. Achieving stardom in 1953 with Gentlemen Prefer Blondes, Monroe was adoringly contrary on screen. Innocent one minute, naughty the next, she was always desirable in films like Niagara, Bus Stop, and The 7-Year Itch. Although she longed to be taken seriously as an actress, Marilyn Monroe's legacy rested on roles that lionized her as the American male's favorite sexual fantasy.
The historical epic has been one of the most consistently produced genres in Hollywood for almost a century. As one of humanity's most accessible creative outlets, history harks back to heroes, to villains, to battles, to love stories, and to myths that have slowly evolved over hundreds, if not thousands of years.
Immortality! Take it!
It's yours! These adventures provide a level of carefree, exciting escapism for the viewer, escapism that audiences have needed during times of war and other periods of social or financial uncertainty. And production companies have taken advantage of this untapped potential to make a lot of money. For reference, the 7th highest grossing movie of all time, if you account for inflation, is the 1956 biblical epic The Ten Commandments.
We'll learn if a god of shepherds is stronger than the gods of Pharaoh.
And while they don't technically qualify as historical epics because they're not set in ancient times, also in the top 10 are Dr. Zhivago and the highest grossing movie by an absolute mile, Gone with the Wind.
Frankly, my dear, I don't give a damn.
Back when the Hollywood studio system reigned supreme, between 1920 and 1948, film production was dominated by the 5 main production companies: Paramount, Warner Brothers, MGM, RKO, and Fox, which later became 20th Century Fox. They had a stranglehold on the theatres and therefore could package their bad films with more premium offerings, often referred to as A and B movies, in a double billing to ensure large profits. But in order to dump their bad films on audiences, they needed guaranteed big draw A movies.
MGM realized the success of the new company depended on Ben-Hur.
Along with lavish musicals, the Sword and Sandal epic became one of these big attractions. Audiences were impressed with the scale, the story, the grandeur. But with scale comes cost. Sets are expensive, filming on location is expensive, and hiring extras for large set pieces is astronomically expensive.
It wasn't until the AT&T company in 1949 finished installing the coax cables all over the country that TV was a unifying factor. These cables were able to carry telephone and television signals from one spot in the country to anywhere else. Television changed America in a way that wouldn't come again until the invention of the internet. Because networks were able to broadcast the same thing at the same time all across the country, there were no more rural separations. People in cities were watching the same thing as people out in the farms. Regional differences were ironed out as the country had something to collectively talk about. Before the internet, TV was the most effective way to get information out there because everyone was watching the same thing. With a wider audience, TV during the 50s grew. The number of stations from 1949 to 1969 grew from 69 to 566. The amount of advertisements paid went from $58 million in 1949 to $1.5 billion in 1969. Also, when television grew, the genres of shows grew to include favorites like Western, kids' cartoons, situational comedies, game shows, dramas, news, and sporting programs. Perhaps we could argue that television had such a great effect during this time because of its fast-growing popularity. But still, what do we see in TV that is like the real households? Let's take a look at what real 50s families were like. More and more women were getting married before the age of 25. Up to 70% of women were married by the age of 24 in 1960. In decades before, marriages and birth rates suffered because of depression troubles and wartime separation. Perhaps the reason that people were getting married so early was because they were afraid it would never happen, or that tribulations down the road would keep them from raising a family like their parents. Instead, young couples rushed to get married while it appeared that things were on the up. We already know that the 50s was a time of post-war economic rise. It makes sense then that many people saw the 50s as a good time to start a family because the man's job seemed secure, the economy was stable, and the unemployment rate was way down. Some women even took jobs outside of the home, which added to the family's income. Even though most families lived in small development homes, many were able to afford bigger suburban houses in later years. Even though the 50s were edging towards the height of the Cold War, and many pamphlets and magazines emphasized bunker mentality, most people in the 50s dismissed the threat of nuclear war with the USSR as incredibly unlikely. This information would suggest that the 50s was to some level unconcerned when it came to foreign affairs. Cold War nuclear reminders were everywhere, public spaces, on the newscasts, but most people seemed to ignore it. In conclusion, I believe that television was a great influence on American culture because it was essentially the first internet, so its reach was widely spread. Also, after the 2-decade period of chaos after the 1930s Depression and the 1940s World War, the safe and stable families on television seemed like something good to aspire to be. Television families were greatly unrealistic, but they were pleasing to the average American, and thus set a goal to be obtained. Television may not have invented the 50s household, but it did romanticize it, giving Americans some image of perfection to strive for.
In Rebel Without a Cause, his eyes hold a weight to them. The weight of his parents, the weight of his father not being a man and not fighting back, the weight of his problems he's created with all the past towns he lived in, the weight of his mother using him as an excuse to move. But his body is free, like a bird flying to test how high he can actually fly. Things seem to go smoothly in the new town of LA. He only gets into a knife fight to prove he's good enough to be part of the cool kids group. Then does a chicken run, and it was looking like he was making friends. Well, until Buzz went off a cliff, killing himself on accident.
Just turn the handle, Buzz. Maybe hit the things called brakes. Are there no brakes in cars in the 60s? Just hit the brakes.
He does stand up to his father and mother, getting it all off his chest. You can see in the whole scene, it's like more and more gasoline being thrown onto a fire. After the fight, everything seems lighter. His eyes don't hold a certain weight to them, and his body is more open and free. He found some friends, and in the end, he loses one to authority.
Heavier than usual tonight.
Really? From where I stand, the sun is shining all over the place.
And finally, at number 1, Singin' in the Rain. Ask anyone to name a musical. Fan of the genre or not, we're willing to bet that 99% of those answers would be none other than Singin' in the Rain. Easily the most recognizable musical number on the planet, and for good reason. Known as musical theater gold, Gene Kelly stars and directs the entire film. He also shot his famous lamp twirling, umbrella spinning, splash through the puddled streets with a fever of 103 over 2 long shoot days.
Good morning.
Good morning. We've talked the whole night through.
Good morning.
Not to be outdone, the musical number Good Morning, which was shot over 1 long shoot day, ended with co-star Debbie Reynolds bleeding out of her dance shoes, prompting the actress's popular quote of "Singin' in the rain and childbirth were 2 of the hardest things I've ever had to do in my life." The film's popularity and rightful number 1 spot is proven in its never-ending effect on pop culture, including commercials, and even our favorite heartthrob boys, BTS. To put it bluntly, no matter what decade you're on for your musical countdown, Singin' in the Rain may just have a rightful claim to being the best movie musical of all time. So like I said at the beginning of the video, if we missed any of your favorite numbers in our countdown, yell at us, let us know in the comments below. We want to hear it. And until next time, I'm Mark Daniel Patrick, and thanks so much for watching.